local people, important issues. CBS 10 WILM's weekly focus on the Lower Cape Fear region. This is Byline Wilmington with your host, Don Ansell.
Welcome and a very good morning to you. Well, most experts agree that this hurricane season will spawn some pretty major storm activity. What's the forecast for us here on the North Carolina coast? Terry Lebo with the Wilmington Bureau of the National Weather Service joins us as our guest to talk about the season and what we may expect. Terry, thanks for joining us. Good morning to you.
Happy to be here. Good morning.
Appreciate it. All right, I'm always interested, what draws people to their careers? What made you go into meteorology?
Well, when I was a kid, there was a large snowstorm, and I ended up really enjoying that. And the weather has always fascinated me.
You?
And science has always fascinated me. So,
yeah. As a kid, you grew up where?
Pennsylvania.
All right, so you didn't really have hurricane activity per se.
No, we would get remnants.
Did you follow if hurricanes would be out in the Atlantic? Would you follow that as a kid, or
not so much?
No.
It was more the snowstorms and the chance of missing school. That was the main thing.
I can relate to that. Listening to the radio, waiting for the school closings. And how long have you been at the Wilmington Bureau?
7 years now.
How many folks work there?
In our office, we have 22.
Wow. So it's a major hub for the National Weather Service, would
Well,
you say?
each office has a total of 10 forecasters, and then there are management and electronics technicians and support staff. So we have a total of 10 forecasters, and then we have 3 or 4 meteorologist interns or hydrometeorological technicians. We're basically the guys that do the forecasting, and then we have the management and the support
It's a pretty big
staff.
responsibility, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
So you studied meteorology in college?
Yes.
And did you have a specialty, or is it just I'm studying meteorology?
Well, I actually started with severe weather. I was really interested in that, and I actually did a little bit of forensic meteorology too. That would be like any court cases, slip and falls, but also sometimes if they needed a weather expert for a trial or something. So that was kind of, I thought that was always very interesting. Mm-hmm. But it was when I got to Wilmington that I really started to embrace hurricanes.
And I can understand why. I think we've all embraced them in one form or another. So, to date, how would you characterize the season so far?
It's been about what I expected.
Now, is that typical? Is it sort of is the activity normal, under? Can you characterize it like that?
It's close. It may be a little bit more active because
really,
well, slightly, because we did have the hurricane early in the season, and it did go to a hurricane. So that was a little unusual. But you're always going to have little bits of unusuality even in a normal season.
In a typical,
right.
Whatever that means.
Exactly.
And is what you're seeing now any indication, or can you take anything from what's happening now forward?
Well, you can look at trends. You can look at the sea surface temperatures and see that they're warmer than they typically are. So that would tend to help generate tropical systems, your tropical depressions, your storms, and your hurricanes. Also, you're getting the atmospheric conditions set up where we have the kind of the Bermuda high has set up, and we're getting the upper ridge, and there are a couple disturbances out there right now that
could develop.
Yes, that could.
Yeah. Now, in our part of the globe, the storm activity that has the potential to become a hurricane develops where? Off of Africa?
Well, that's one area that they start to generate is off the coast of Africa, and those are called Cape Verde storms. Uh-huh. They also sometimes will develop in the Caribbean. You'll also get some that develop in the Gulf, and typically they're either late in the season or early in the season. We actually saw this year, we had a couple that developed, a couple disturbances, and then we did have the one storm that developed in the Gulf. And sometimes we'll get these fronts that move off the Carolina coast, and they'll sit there, and then you'll start to get a low pressure area that develops on that front, and sometimes they'll classify it as a subtropical depression, which means it's starting out as a typical low like you would see in the winter, but it starts to gain tropical characteristics, and sometimes they can just develop as a tropical right away. So that's something
But
we always have to
usually
watch
they're too
out.
close to land to make a hurricane?
Well, sometimes they will, but they have to be...
Typically not.
Right. I mean, and even if it were a hurricane, it would be a minimal Cat 1. They just, like you said, they just don't have the time to strengthen.
Yeah. So Africa, the Caribbean, the Gulf, any one of those more dangerous potential than another?
I guess that depends on where you live. In the Gulf, you wouldn't want something developing in the Gulf if you lived off the Gulf Coast. For us, the Cape Verde storms, they typically
The ones
tend
off
to be...
of Africa?
Right. Isabel.
They have more time to...
Right, and they kind of move across the Atlantic, and then they curve up the East Coast. And Isabel, one of the most recent ones that we had, Hugo was kind of one of those storms, although Hugo developed a little further west of the typical generation area.
Now, without getting too technical, can you give us a simple explanation of what forces need to come together to produce what might become a storm that might develop into a hurricane?
Well, you're going to need the warm ocean
water,
temperatures
yeah.
because that's what fuels the storm. That's what fuels the convection. You're going to need light winds aloft. If you get wind shear, what will happen is the storms will start to build up, and then they get pulled apart, the individual thunderstorms. Because a tropical system will start as individual thunderstorms that become organized. But if you have them developing and then being pulled apart, you can't develop. So you need favorable winds, and you're going to need warm water. And those are the two main things that you need.
And then the wind starts swirling and picking up this warm water.
Right.
And then the eye starts developing in the center of all that, and it starts to move.
Correct.
And the hurricanes, the storms that develop into those hurricanes here are called hurricanes, but in the Pacific they call them cyclones.
Correct.
And they're really the same.
They're the same animal.
How did we come to develop two different names? Do you know?
No, that's something that I don't know. And in fact, I'm trying to remember the name for them in India, in the Indian Ocean. They have a different name for them.
It's still the same phenomenon.
You have the typhoons in the Pacific, and then you have the cyclones.
Oh, it's typhoon in the Pacific.
Typhoon in the Pacific and cyclone, in the Indian Ocean and down into parts of Australia.
Okay, so there's three names actually for these storms.
And actually,
cyclones.
some locations they'll have their own terminology for them.
Okay, all right. We're gonna take a break. We'll come back. We got a lot of chat and conversation. Next, we're going to talk about climate change and what impact is that having, if any. Is there climate change or global warming? We'll be right back. Stay with us.